If nobody stops him tonight, someone innocent will pay the price. The words were barely above a whisper, yet they seemed louder than the orchestra playing beneath the crystal chandeliers. For one frozen second, the entire ballroom felt as though it had stopped breathing. The Royce Foundation Gala was supposed to be the most celebrated charity event in Chicago that year. More than 600 guests filled the grand hall of the Lexington Crown Hotel. Investors, politicians, media executives, celebrities, the kind of people whose names appeared in magazines and whose decisions moved markets. Gold lights spilled from chandeliers the size of compact cars. Champagne sparkled beneath polished glass. A string quartet performed near the marble staircase, while servers in black uniforms moved silently between tables worth more than some families earned in a year. Everything looked perfect. That was the problem. Perfect appearances have a way of hiding ugly truths. Near the center of the ballroom stood Nathaniel Royce, the billionaire founder and CEO of Royce Dynamics. At 39, he was the face of modern success. Business magazines called him visionary. Financial networks called him unstoppable. Employees called him demanding when cameras were around, and something much harsher when they were not. His tailored navy suit fit like armor. His smile looked practiced. His confidence filled every corner of the room. People watched him the way sailors watch a storm on the horizon, fascinated, impressed, and slightly afraid. Beside him stood his wife, Evelyn Royce, 7 months pregnant, elegant in a pale blue evening gown. Her hand rested gently against her stomach as she greeted guests with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Most people saw beauty. Few noticed exhaustion. Fewer noticed fear. The evening had been carefully choreographed from the beginning. Every speech timed to the second. Every camera angle planned. Every headline practically written before the event even started. Nathaniel loved control. Control was his favorite currency. And tonight, he appeared to have plenty of it. Then something changed. It started with a conversation nobody else could hear. Nathaniel leaned closer. Evelyn answered softly. The smile vanished from his face. Around them, conversations continued. Glasses clinked. Laughter floated through the room. Nobody noticed the tension gathering like thunderclouds. Nobody except one person. Standing 20 feet away beside a serving station was Amara Lewis, 24 years old. Black waitress, daughter of a retired city bus driver, working double shifts to help support her mother through expensive medical treatments. To most guests, she was invisible. Just another employee carrying trays and refilling glasses. But invisible people often see the most. Amara noticed Evelyn's shoulders tense. She noticed the way Evelyn lowered her eyes. She noticed Nathaniel's jaw tighten. Small details, tiny warning signs, the kind most people ignore. Then came the silence. A strange silence. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that spreads through a crowd when something feels wrong, but nobody wants to acknowledge it. Conversations faded. Heads slowly turned. The orchestra faltered for half a beat before continuing. Nathaniel's expression had transformed completely. The charming billionaire was gone. Something colder stood in his place. Guests exchanged nervous glances. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because power changes people. Sometimes it inspires them. Sometimes it frightens them. And sometimes it convinces entire rooms to look away. Amara felt her heartbeat quicken. Around her, other staff members pretended not to notice. A manager stared at the floor. Several guests suddenly became fascinated by their phones. An investor near the stage quietly stepped backward. The room was full of influential people, powerful people, important people. Yet in that moment, courage seemed to be the rarest thing inside the building. Across the ballroom, Evelyn's hand instinctively moved protectively over her unborn child. Her eyes searched the crowd. Not for attention, not for sympathy, for help, just help. And what she found instead was hesitation. Hundreds of people, hundreds of witnesses. Yet nobody stepped forward. Nobody wanted to challenge the billionaire whose name was on the building, whose donations funded charities, whose influence reached boardrooms, city halls, and television studios. Nobody wanted to become the target of a man who always got what he wanted. Nobody except one waitress standing beneath a chandelier, holding a silver tray with trembling fingers. Because while everyone else saw a billionaire, Amara saw something different. She saw a frightened woman. She saw an unborn child. And she saw a choice that would change every life in that room before the night was over. Long before she found herself standing in that glittering ballroom, Amara Lewis had already learned what it meant to feel invisible. Every morning began at 5:30, not because she wanted it to, but because life did not give her many choices. Her alarm sounded in a small apartment on the south side of Chicago, a place where the heating rattled during winter and the pipes seemed to complain louder than the tenants. She would rise quietly, careful not to wake her mother sleeping in the next room. The woman had spent 28 years driving city buses before illness forced her into early retirement. Medical bills arrived more faithfully than holiday cards. Insurance helped, but never enough. So Amara worked. She worked because there was no one else to do it. She worked because responsibility had arrived early and never left. Most people who saw her carrying trays at luxury events assumed they understood her story. They saw a young black waitress in a pressed uniform and thought they had all the answers. They never imagined she spent evenings reading leadership books borrowed from the public library. They never imagined she had graduated near the top of her community college business program. They never imagined she kept a notebook filled with plans for the restaurant she hoped to own one day. People rarely look beyond the uniform. Amara had learned that lesson years ago. She had also learned not to let bitterness make a home inside her heart. Every shift brought challenges. Some guests ignored her completely. Others spoke to her as if kindness cost money. A few remembered her name. Those were the ones she never forgot. Her mother used to tell her something whenever life became difficult. Dignity is not something people give you. It is something you carry. Amara carried those words everywhere. She carried them through double shifts, through missed holidays, through nights when exhaustion felt heavier than gravity. And somehow she still managed to smile. Not the forced smile required by customer service. A real one. The kind that survives disappointment. Earlier that same afternoon, before the gala began, Amara had arrived through the employee entrance carrying a cup of coffee and a notebook tucked beneath her arm. The Lexington Crown Hotel was already buzzing with preparation. Florists rushed through hallways. Event planners spoke into headsets. Security teams checked guest lists. Everywhere she looked, people were preparing for perfection. During her lunch break, Amara sat alone in the staff cafeteria and opened her notebook. On one page, she had written a simple sentence. "One day I will own something nobody can take away from me." Beneath it sat sketches of a neighborhood cafe. Nothing fancy, just a place where people felt welcome. A place where kindness mattered more than status. She stared at the words for several minutes before returning to work. She did not know that by nightfall her own life would be moving toward a crossroads she never expected. Back in the ballroom, the tension continued spreading through the crowd like a crack moving through glass. Guests exchanged uncertain looks. Nobody seemed sure whether to leave, intervene, or pretend nothing was wrong. The powerful often create a strange gravity around themselves. People fear being pulled into conflict, fear losing opportunities, fear becoming targets. Nathaniel Royce understood that better than anyone. His influence reached far beyond his company. Donations, partnerships, political connections. Entire careers had been built around staying in his good graces. That was why the silence felt so heavy. It was not simply hesitation. It was fear wearing expensive clothing. Amara could see it everywhere she looked. In the lowered eyes, in the nervous smiles, in the guests suddenly studying their phones. The room was filled with successful people, yet courage seemed absent from every table. Then her eyes returned to Evelyn. For just a moment, their gazes met across the ballroom. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Amara saw something there that she recognized immediately. Not weakness, not helplessness, loneliness. The kind that comes when everyone around you sees the problem, but nobody chooses to acknowledge it. And in that instant, standing beneath a chandelier worth more than her yearly salary, Amara felt something inside her settle. Fear was still there. Common sense was still there. But another feeling had become stronger. Because sometimes the difference between an ordinary night and a life-changing one begins with a single decision. And Amara Lewis was only seconds away from making hers. The truth was that Nathaniel Royce had spent years convincing the world that he had the perfect life. Magazine covers showed him smiling beside Evelyn at charity events. Business journals praised them as Chicago's most influential power couple. Social media displayed carefully staged photographs from luxury vacations, fundraising galas, and corporate celebrations. To outsiders, they looked untouchable, successful, happy. But appearances are often the most expensive form of fiction. As the silence settled over the ballroom, Memories flickered through Evelyn's mind like old photographs. There had been a time when Nathaniel was different. Before the billion-dollar acquisitions. Before the television interviews. Before every conversation became a calculation. They met 12 years earlier at a university entrepreneurship conference. Nathaniel was ambitious even then, but ambition had not yet consumed him. He used to laugh more, listen more, dream more. Somewhere along the road to success, something changed. The company grew. The money multiplied. Expectations became heavier. Investors demanded results. Competitors attacked from every direction. Nathaniel responded the only way he knew how. He tightened his grip on everything around him. Employees, executives, friends, even family. Control became his solution to every problem. At first the changes were small. A canceled vacation because of a business meeting. A forgotten anniversary because of a merger. Negotiation. Then came the endless phone calls during dinner. The impatience. The distance. The constant pressure to maintain a flawless image. Evelyn told herself it was temporary. She believed success would eventually create peace. Instead, success seemed to create hunger. The more Nathaniel gained, the more he feared losing. And fear has a way of disguising itself as confidence. Few people understood how isolated Evelyn had become. Living inside a mansion did not protect someone from loneliness. In many ways, it amplified it. Every room felt larger. Every silence felt longer. Even tonight, surrounded by hundreds of guests, she felt completely alone. Earlier that week, she had sat in a doctor's office listening to the steady rhythm of her unborn child's heartbeat. It was the happiest sound she had heard in months. For a few precious minutes, business reports, stock prices, and public expectations disappeared. There was only hope. She remembered smiling all the way home. She also remembered Nathaniel answering 3 business calls before she could tell him about the appointment. It was not cruelty, at least not in the way people usually imagine. It was something quieter, a gradual erosion, a life where priorities shifted until relationships became secondary to performance. The tragedy was that Nathaniel probably did not even realize how far he had drifted. Standing across the ballroom now, he looked less like a husband and more like a man defending a kingdom nobody had asked him to build. Amara could see pieces of that story without knowing all the details. Years of serving wealthy guests had taught her something important. Money changed circumstances. It did not automatically improve character. She had watched millionaires argue over trivial inconveniences. She had seen ordinary workers share their last dollar with strangers. Wealth revealed people. It did not define them. Around the room, whispers began circulating. Small fragments of conversation. Nervous observations. Questions nobody wanted to ask out loud. Several guests exchanged concerned glances. A board member from Royce Dynamics quietly removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. A reporter standing near the back lowered her phone and watched carefully. The atmosphere had changed. What began as discomfort was slowly becoming awareness. And awareness can be dangerous. Because once people truly see something, pretending becomes much harder. Nathaniel still commanded the room. But for the first time all evening, the illusion of perfection showed cracks. Tiny cracks, barely visible, yet impossible to ignore. And as Amara stood holding her tray beneath the golden light of the chandeliers, she realized the next few moments would determine whether those cracks disappeared forever or widened into something neither Nathaniel nor anyone else could control. The strange thing about silence is that it grows heavier the longer people carry it. What began as an uncomfortable pause was now settling over the ballroom like a storm cloud nobody wanted to acknowledge. The music had stopped completely. The string quartet sat frozen near the stage. Conversations had vanished. Even the waitstaff moved more slowly, sensing that something important was unfolding beneath the polished surface of the evening. Yet still, nobody stepped forward. A senator standing near the center table adjusted his tie and looked away. A venture capitalist who had just spent 20 minutes praising courage in business suddenly found the marble floor fascinating. Several executives exchanged worried glances, but remained exactly where they were. Everyone seemed to be waiting for someone else to act. Someone else to take the risk. Someone else to become the target. Fear has a remarkable way of disguising itself as practicality. People tell themselves they are staying out of it because it is not their business. They convince themselves they do not know the full story. They remind themselves of careers, reputations, opportunities, and consequences. The human mind is incredibly creative when searching for reasons to remain comfortable. Amara knew that because she felt it too. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it above the silence. She thought about her mother. She thought about the rent due next week. She thought about the health insurance she could not afford to lose. One complaint from the wrong guest could end everything she had spent years building. The hotel depended on wealthy clients. Nathaniel Royce was not just wealthy. He was powerful. The difference mattered. Powerful people did not simply influence rooms. They influenced futures. Amara understood that better than most. For a moment, she remained perfectly still. The silver tray in her hands suddenly felt heavier than it had all night. Around her, fellow employees avoided eye contact. One young server gave her a warning look as if silently saying, "Do not get involved." Another employee slowly shook his head. Their message was clear. Stay invisible. Stay safe. Stay employed. Across the ballroom, Evelyn lowered her gaze again. The movement was small, almost imperceptible, yet it carried more weight than any speech delivered that evening. It was the look of someone who had stopped expecting help, and somehow that hurt more than anything else. Amara remembered her mother sitting at the kitchen table years earlier after a difficult day. She remembered the words almost perfectly. The world does not change because good people exist. It changes because good people decide to act. At the time, she had been 16 and barely understood what her mother meant. Tonight, she understood completely. The room was full of educated people, successful people, influential people. Yet none of those qualities mattered if courage was missing. A notification suddenly flashed on a reporter's phone near the back of the room. The glow briefly illuminated her face before disappearing. Nearby, two board members from Royce Dynamics exchanged tense whispers. Something was shifting. The illusion of control was weakening. People could feel it. They just were not ready to acknowledge it yet. Nathaniel still stood at the center of the room, projecting confidence, authority, and certainty. But for the first time all evening, uncertainty had entered the ballroom. It moved quietly from table to table, from guest to guest, like a question nobody wanted to answer. What happens when the wrong person finally decides to speak? Amara inhaled slowly. Then again, fear remained. So did doubt. Courage is rarely the absence of fear. More often it is the decision that something else matters more. She set the tray down on a nearby service station. The faint metallic sound echoed through the silence. Several heads turned immediately. A manager looked up. Guests noticed. Even Nathaniel's attention shifted slightly. One small sound. One small movement. Yet somehow it felt enormous. Because sometimes history does not announce itself with fireworks or headlines. Sometimes it begins with a single person deciding they can no longer stand still. Amara took her first step forward before she could change her mind. The polished marble floor reflected the chandelier light beneath her shoes as every eye in the ballroom followed her movement. One step became two. Two became five. The distance was not far, perhaps 30 feet, yet it felt longer than any journey she had ever taken. The room remained silent. Guests watched with the same stunned fascination people reserve for moments they know they will remember years later. A billionaire stood at the center of the room. A waitress was walking directly toward him. Nothing about that equation made sense. Yet nobody looked away. Nathaniel noticed her now. Completely. His eyes narrowed slightly as if trying to understand what he was seeing. Employees did not approach him uninvited. Certainly not during one of the most important nights of his year. Around him, several executives shifted uncomfortably. A hotel manager near the stage looked as though he might intervene, then thought better of it. Fear still controlled the room. But curiosity had begun fighting back. Amara stopped a few feet away. Close enough to speak. Close enough for everyone to hear. Her pulse hammered against her ribs. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her. One wrong word could cost her everything. Yet when she finally spoke, her voice surprised even her. It was calm, steady, clear. "Sir," she said softly, "I think Mrs. Royce needs a moment to sit down." The sentence was simple, respectful, almost impossible to argue with. Yet the effect was immediate. Several guests inhaled sharply. Someone dropped a fork near the back of the room. The metallic clatter echoed through the silence like a starting gun. Evelyn looked up first. For a brief second, disbelief crossed her face. Not because of what Amara had said, but because someone had finally said something. Nathaniel stared at the young waitress standing before him. The muscles in his jaw tightened. He was not accustomed to interruption, especially not from someone he considered outside his world. "And who exactly asked for your opinion?" he replied. His voice was controlled, but there was an edge beneath it now. The kind of edge people recognize when patience begins running out. Several guests immediately looked away. The old instincts returned. Stay quiet. Stay safe. Pretend nothing is happening. But something had changed. Amara could feel it. The room no longer belonged entirely to Nathaniel. People were watching him differently. Not as a visionary. Not as a billionaire. Simply as a man being observed. And observation changes power. "Nobody asked, sir," Amara answered. "I just thought someone should make sure she is okay." Another silence followed. Longer this time. Heavier. Across the ballroom, a reporter subtly raised her phone. Nearby, another guest did the same. Then another. Tiny glowing screens appeared one by one. Not openly. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like stars emerging after sunset. Nathaniel noticed them. So did everyone else. The atmosphere shifted again. Suddenly, this was no longer a private moment surrounded by witnesses. It was becoming a public moment. A documented moment. The difference mattered. For the first time all evening, uncertainty flickered across Nathaniel's face. It lasted less than a second. Most people missed it. Amara did not. Neither did Evelyn. The unborn child she carried moved gently beneath her hand, and something inside her seemed to awaken. Hope. Small. Fragile. But real. Around the room, guests who had remained silent began exchanging looks. Not fearful looks anymore. Questioning ones. The spell of authority was weakening. Because courage has a strange quality. It spreads. One person acts. Then another begins to wonder if they should have acted too. And another. And another. Nathaniel remained standing beneath the chandelier light, but the room no longer felt frozen. It felt unstable, like ice beginning to crack beneath enormous weight. And nobody understood that better than Amara Lewis, because the moment she stepped forward, this story stopped belonging to the billionaire. It started belonging to everyone who had watched in silence. The change in the room was subtle at first, but Nathaniel Royce felt it immediately. For years he had walked into boardrooms and watched conversations stop. He had built an empire on confidence, precision, and authority. People usually adjusted themselves around him. They agreed. They nodded. They moved out of the way. Tonight, for the first time in a very long time, the room was not adjusting to him. The room was studying him. That realization settled heavily behind his eyes. He glanced around the ballroom. Phones were visible now. Not many, but enough. Investors who normally rushed to shake his hand stood quietly near their tables. A television reporter remained perfectly still, her attention fixed on the unfolding scene. Even members of his own executive team seemed uncertain. The certainty he had carried into the evening was beginning to slip. "You are creating a distraction," Nathaniel said finally, his voice measured. The sentence was directed at Amara, but everyone knew he was speaking to the entire room. People came here to support important causes, not to interfere in private matters. Several guests nodded automatically. Old habits die hard. Yet the response lacked conviction. Amara noticed it immediately. The room was no longer divided between powerful people and powerless people. It was divided between those willing to acknowledge what they had witnessed and those still trying to avoid it. "I understand, sir," Amara replied. "But sometimes people need a moment more than they need appearances." The words landed softly, yet they carried surprising weight. A few guests exchanged looks. One older woman seated near the front slowly lowered her champagne glass. Another guest quietly murmured something to the person beside him. The atmosphere continued shifting. Nathaniel folded his arms. The move looked confident from a distance, but internally he felt something unfamiliar. Frustration. Not because of the waitress. Because of the loss of control. Control had always been his strongest advantage. He controlled meetings. He controlled negotiations. He controlled narratives. Yet narratives become difficult to control once witnesses begin forming their own conclusions. Evelyn remained silent, but her posture changed slightly. For the first time that evening, her shoulders were no longer drawn inward. It was a small change. Most people missed it. Amara did not. Neither did several guests watching closely from nearby tables. Hope often begins with tiny movements. Nathaniel noticed the change too. For a brief moment, something flickered across his face. Not anger. Something closer to uncertainty. The realization that the situation was moving beyond his ability to direct it. Nearby, A member of the hotel staff approached cautiously with a chair. Another employee brought a glass of water. Suddenly people were moving. Not dramatically, not heroically, just enough to signal that the paralysis gripping the room was breaking apart. One action had inspired another, then another. Courage, Amara realized, spreads faster than fear once it finally begins. The ballroom no longer felt frozen. It felt awake. Guests who had remained silent for nearly 10 minutes were beginning to speak. Questions emerged. Conversations restarted. The illusion that everyone agreed had disappeared. And with it, the invisible shield that power often creates. Nathaniel stood beneath the chandeliers, surrounded by wealth, influence, and prestige. Yet for the first time all night, none of those things seemed to matter as much as a simple truth. A young waitress had stepped forward when nobody else would. And now an entire room was being forced to decide what kind of people they wanted to be. Just when it seemed the tension in the ballroom could not climb any higher, an unexpected voice broke through the crowd. There is something you all need to see. The speaker was not a journalist, an investor, or a member of the Royce family. It was Daniel Mercer, the hotel's director of security. Until that moment, he had remained near the back of the room, quietly observing everything. Now hundreds of eyes turned toward him. Daniel held a small tablet in one hand. His expression was calm, but there was a seriousness in his posture that immediately commanded attention. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. For the first time that evening, genuine concern appeared on his face. Daniel took a slow breath before speaking again. Earlier tonight, before the gala officially began, one of our internal security systems flagged an incident in a restricted corridor. Murmurs spread across the room. Guests exchanged puzzled looks. Several reporters immediately lifted their phones higher. Daniel continued. The footage was reviewed as part of our standard protocol. Under normal circumstances, it would have remained private. But given what has happened tonight, I believe it provides important context. The ballroom grew silent once more. Not fearful silence this time. Anticipatory silence. The kind that appears when people sense a truth approaching. Daniel tapped the screen. Moments later, one of the large display monitors used for the evening's charity presentations flickered to life. A video appeared. The footage showed a quiet hallway earlier that afternoon. There was no confrontation, no dramatic scene. Instead, guests watched something far more revealing. Evelyn stood alone near a window, looking exhausted. A hotel employee approached and asked if she needed assistance. Evelyn smiled politely and said she was fine. Yet the cameras captured something her public appearances never did. The sadness in her eyes. The loneliness. The visible strain she had carried long before tonight. Then another figure entered the frame. Nathaniel. The recording had no audio, but it did not need any. Guests watched as Evelyn attempted to speak with him. They watched him glance repeatedly at his phone. They watched her expression slowly fade. They watched him walk away before the conversation appeared finished. The video lasted less than 2 minutes. Yet when it ended, the ballroom felt completely different. Because the footage revealed something no public relations team could explain away. It revealed distance. It revealed neglect. It revealed a marriage struggling beneath the weight of appearances. No scandal. No sensational revelation. Just a quiet truth that felt impossible to ignore. Evelyn lowered her eyes. Several guests looked visibly moved. One woman near the front reached for a tissue. An investor seated beside her quietly shook his head. The room was no longer discussing a single moment. It was beginning to recognize a larger story. Nathaniel stared at the darkened screen. For several seconds he said nothing. The billionaire who always had an answer suddenly seemed unable to find one. Amara stood quietly nearby, watching the reactions spread through the crowd. She had not expected this. Neither had anyone else. Yet the footage accomplished something remarkable. It shifted the conversation away from power and toward humanity. People were no longer asking who controlled the room. They were asking who needed help. And that question changed everything. Because once people stop seeing status and start seeing suffering, the entire balance of a story begins to change. The moment the screen went dark, the ballroom seemed smaller. Not physically, emotionally. The towering ceilings, the crystal chandeliers, the polished marble floors suddenly felt unable to contain the weight of what everyone had just witnessed. Nobody rushed back to their conversations. Nobody returned to discussing investments or charitable initiatives. The room had crossed an invisible line. There was no going back. Across the crowd, Phones vibrated almost simultaneously. Reporters were already sending messages. Investors were checking notifications. Guests were quietly sharing clips and observations with people outside the ballroom. Information moves quickly in the modern world. Perception moves even faster. Nathaniel understood that better than anyone. He had spent 2 decades building an image of discipline, leadership, stability. Now he could feel that image slipping beyond his reach, not collapsing all at once, eroding, like a shoreline losing ground one wave at a time. Near the front of the room, a senior board member from Royce Dynamics stepped away from his table and approached another executive. Their conversation lasted only seconds, but the expressions on their faces said enough. They were concerned, deeply concerned. For years they had defended Nathaniel's decisions because the company continued growing. Investors remained happy. Profits climbed higher every quarter. But tonight was different. Corporate leaders fear one thing above all else: uncertainty. And uncertainty had arrived wearing a tuxedo. A financial journalist quietly exited the ballroom. Within minutes, an online article appeared mentioning an unexpected disruption at the gala. The details were vague. The implications were not. More notifications followed. More messages. More whispers. The atmosphere became electric. Not with excitement. With consequence. Nathaniel looked around and realized something unsettling. Nobody seemed focused on him anymore. They were focused on what happened next. That distinction mattered. Powerful people often believe they control the story. Yet eventually the story begins making its own decisions. Across the room, Evelyn accepted the glass of water offered by a hotel employee. Several guests approached her with genuine concern. Not performative concern. Not public relations concern. Human concern. For perhaps the first time in years, people were seeing her as an individual rather than an accessory to a billionaire success story. The difference showed in her eyes. Nearby, Amara stood quietly beside the service station. She had not sought attention. She had not planned any of this. Yet people kept glancing toward her. A reporter briefly approached and asked for a comment. Amara politely declined. An investor nodded respectfully as he passed. A hotel employee squeezed her shoulder and whispered, "Thank you." The words caught her off guard. Because until tonight, nobody had ever thanked her for simply doing what felt right. Nathaniel noticed all of it. The shifting loyalties. The changing perceptions. The growing distance between himself and the crowd he once commanded effortlessly. For years, influence had flowed toward him like a river. Tonight it was flowing somewhere else. Toward truth. Toward accountability. Toward questions nobody wanted to ignore anymore. Near the ballroom entrance, several members of Royce Dynamics' leadership team gathered together. Their expressions were serious. Their conversations quiet. Yet their body language revealed the truth. Emergency meetings would follow. Investors would demand answers. Public statements would need to be crafted. Damage control would begin before sunrise. The consequences had not fully arrived yet, but everyone could hear them approaching, like distant thunder rolling toward the city. And standing beneath the fading glow of the chandeliers, Nathaniel Royce finally understood something that countless powerful people learned too late. Building an empire can take decades. Losing the trust that supports it can begin in a single night. 3 months later, Chicago was covered in the soft colors of early spring. The snow had melted. The trees were beginning to wake from winter. And life, despite everything, had continued moving forward. The headlines that once dominated business news had gradually faded from public attention. Emergency board meetings had come and gone. Investors had made their decisions. Corporate statements had been released. Analysts had debated every detail on television. Yet the most important story had never been about stock prices or public relations. It had always been about people. On a quiet Tuesday morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of St. Matthew Medical Center. In a private room overlooking Lake Michigan, Evelyn sat in a comfortable chair, holding a sleeping newborn wrapped in a pale blue blanket. The room was peaceful. No cameras, no reporters, no executives, just the gentle rhythm of a baby's breathing. For the first time in a very long while, Evelyn looked genuinely at peace. The exhaustion was still there. Motherhood had arrived with long nights and endless responsibilities. But something else had arrived too. Freedom. Not the dramatic kind people celebrate in movies. The quieter kind. The kind that allows someone to wake up each morning without carrying the weight of constant fear, pressure, or expectations. The baby stirred slightly before settling back to sleep. Evelyn smiled. It was the same smile she used to have years ago before life became complicated. Across the room sat a small bouquet of flowers. Attached was a handwritten note. It read, "Every child deserves a future built on kindness. Congratulations, Amara." Evelyn had read the note 3 times already. Each time it brought tears to her eyes. Because sometimes the people who change your life arrive wearing uniforms instead of titles. Meanwhile, across town, Amara Lewis was finishing another shift. Some things had changed. Others had not. She still worked hard. She still helped care for her mother. She still carried her notebook filled with business plans. Yet opportunities had begun appearing in unexpected places. A local entrepreneur had offered to mentor her. Several community leaders had reached out after hearing her story. One investor even offered support for the neighborhood cafe she had dreamed about for years. Amara accepted none of it immediately. She moved carefully, thoughtfully, because she had never stepped forward that night hoping for recognition. She had simply done what she believed was right. That mattered. In a city filled with powerful people, she remained grounded by ordinary values. One afternoon, as she walked home beneath blooming trees, her phone buzzed. A news alert appeared. Nathaniel Royce had officially resigned from the final leadership position he still held within his company. Amara stared at the screen for a moment before placing the phone back in her pocket. She felt no satisfaction, no victory, only reflection. Because the story had never been about one man's downfall. It was about choices. The choices people make when nobody expects them to act. The choices that reveal character when convenience points in another direction. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the Chicago skyline, Amara sat beside her mother at the kitchen table. The apartment was still modest. The bills still existed. Life was still imperfect. Yet something felt different. Her mother reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Neither woman spoke for several seconds. They did not need to. Some truths are too important for words. Outside, the city lights flickered on one by one. Inside, Amara opened her notebook and looked again at the sentence she had written. Months earlier, "One day I will own something nobody can take away from me." Slowly, she smiled and added a second sentence beneath it. Courage was never mine to own. It was mine to use. Because that was the lesson hidden inside everything that happened. Wealth can fill a room. Power can command attention. Influence can shape headlines. But in the end, the most valuable thing in that ballroom was not money, status, or authority. It was a young woman who refused to look away when everyone else did. And that made all the difference.